It started like any other quiet Saturday morning in the suburbs. The sun was just starting to rise, casting soft orange light over the dew-speckled lawns and freshly mulched flower beds of our well-manicured neighborhood. I poured myself a cup of coffee and opened the blinds to my backyard, expecting to be greeted by the familiar view of my towering oak tree swaying gently in the breeze, a tree that had stood tall for more than 4 decades, older than most of the homes in our development, and certainly older than my next-door neighbor, Karen. But instead, I was greeted by nothing. A hollow space. Just sky and sawdust. At first, I thought I was imagining things, maybe looking from the wrong angle or misjudging where the tree should have been. But as I stepped out onto the patio, barefoot and confused, my worst suspicions were confirmed. The massive oak tree, the one I'd grown up with, played under, and carefully maintained since inheriting the home from my parents, was gone. In its place, a stump, barely a foot high, its fresh, pale rings exposed and still wet from the chainsaw's teeth. Scattered sawdust dusted the surrounding grass like cruel confetti. Branches and leaves littered the far end of the yard. There had been no warning, no request, no permission, no city notice, no HOA letter. Nothing. The tree, my tree, had simply been taken, erased. I stood in shock for a moment, barely noticing the buzz of a distant chainsaw still humming from somewhere nearby. And then, slowly, like a curtain being pulled back, I turned my head to the left, toward the neighboring yard, toward the source of the noise. There, beyond the fence, Karen's landscaping crew was hauling the last of the branches onto a flatbed trailer parked in her driveway. The men moved quickly, tossing debris with practiced efficiency. At the edge of the property, Karen herself stood with a clipboard, watching them with arms crossed and a smug look of satisfaction that would come to define the weeks that followed. That's when it hit me. She had done this. Now, let me be clear. Karen had always been difficult. She was the kind of neighbor who measured the height of everyone's grass and sent anonymous complaints to the HOA if someone left their garbage cans out an hour too long. She once tried to get my other neighbor fined for parking a boat in his driveway, even though it was perfectly legal and only there for the weekend. But this, cutting down someone else's tree, that was a new level of audacity, an escalation beyond anything I'd seen from her before. At first, I assumed, hoped, even, that it was all just a misunderstanding, that somehow the crew had mistaken the property line, or that Karen had received faulty instructions. Surely no one could be so brazen as to order the removal of a 40-year-old tree from someone else's yard without so much as a knock on the door. But that hope faded quickly. Later that day, I asked around. No one else in the neighborhood had seen or heard anything unusual, except for one neighbor across the street who told me, casually, that she'd seen Karen speaking with a tree removal service a few days earlier. She even overheard something about getting rid of that ugly old oak. And then came the kicker. When I confronted Karen, calmly, politely, asking why the tree had been cut down, she didn't deny it. She didn't even act surprised. She just smirked and said, "It blocked my afternoon sun. I didn't like the shade it cast on my garden. It needed to go." That was it. No apology. No regret. Just that smug, self-righteous confidence, as if she had done the neighborhood a favor. I walked away that day with a pit in my stomach, but also with a growing sense of resolve. I knew what had to happen next. You don't just erase someone's tree, someone's property, and get away with it because you didn't like the shade. Still, I wasn't the kind of person who rushed to lawyers or lawsuits. I wanted to understand my rights before I made any moves. So that night, I stayed up late researching property law, tree ownership, and local ordinances. What I found shocked me. In my state, trees are considered part of a property's value, and removing one without permission, especially a mature tree with historical or environmental significance, could be grounds for serious legal consequences. Some cases had resulted in damages well into the five-figure range, especially if the tree added aesthetic, environmental, or even energy-saving value to the property. My oak tree checked every box. It was large, mature, and provided shade that helped cool my home in the summer. It had sentimental value, too, but even without that, its loss would be measurable, not just emotionally, but financially. So I called a certified arborist to come assess the stump. I asked for a full report, the age, health, and approximate value of the tree, based on species, size, and contribution to the property. When the estimate came back, it was more than I expected, over $18,000 in value. And that wasn't even counting the cost of removal, cleanup, and landscaping restoration. I had all the proof I needed. Photographs, expert evaluation, property records. Karen had made a mistake, a very, very expensive mistake. But the real challenge hadn't even started yet. Because as I would soon learn, getting someone like Karen to take responsibility for anything, let alone write a check for tens of thousands of dollars, would take more than just facts. It would take a battle. And I was ready. The very next morning, I started documenting everything. I took high-resolution photographs of the stump from every angle. I photographed the property line, the remaining branches that still littered my yard, and even zoomed in on the sawdust still clinging to the grass. I marked the date and time on each file and created a secure folder with backups, anticipating what I knew was coming: resistance, denial, and an all-out attempt to gaslight me into silence. Karen had made a serious error, and the last thing someone like her was going to do was admit it. Before I approached her again, I decided to inform the HOA. While I didn't expect them to be much help, they had a reputation for being toothless when it came to anything not involving paint colors or mailbox designs. I wanted to be sure they couldn't claim ignorance later on. So I filed a formal complaint, complete with the arborist's report, photographs, and a copy of my deed showing the clear property boundary. Their response was as disappointing as it was predictable. They acknowledged the complaint, said they would review the matter internally, and reminded me that disputes between neighbors regarding trees are typically considered private civil matters. In other words, not our problem. Fine. I hadn't expected a hero in khakis and a clipboard to come to my rescue anyway. My next step was contacting a lawyer, someone who specialized in property disputes. I brought everything to the consultation: the photographs, the arborist's valuation, a copy of my HOA complaint, and even screenshots from a neighborhood Facebook group where Karen had previously posted snide comments about my tree ruining her light. The attorney was clear: I had a solid case. Not only had Karen entered my property without permission, but she had also intentionally damaged, destroyed, an asset that could be quantified in real financial terms. In legal language, it fell under a combination of trespassing, unlawful property damage, and potentially even theft of natural resources, depending on how the court interpreted it. Even better, because of the tree's maturity and size, I could potentially pursue treble damages, triple the amount of actual losses, under state statutes that penalize unauthorized tree removal. That meant Karen might owe me not $18,000, but over $50,000. But before we filed anything official, I gave Karen a chance to make it right. My lawyer sent her a formal demand letter, a professional but firm document outlining what she had done, what it had cost, and what we were prepared to pursue if she didn't settle privately. Her response? A handwritten note, stuffed into my mailbox, illegally, I might add, that read simply: I did what I had to do. That tree was a menace. I'm not paying a dime. Okay. No apology. No attempt to negotiate. Just more arrogance, wrapped in her signature perfume-scented stationery. So we moved forward. My lawyer filed a lawsuit in small claims court, citing property damage, trespass, and loss of value. The process began slowly, as these things do, but Karen's reaction was swift. She marched down to the HOA office, furious, and tried to spin the story as if I had wronged her. She claimed the tree was diseased. It wasn't. Said it leaned dangerously over her property. It didn't. And told anyone who would listen that she had every right to remove what threatened her safety. But her story didn't hold up. The arborist's report described the tree as healthy. There were no city citations, no complaints filed about the tree prior to its removal, and no weather damage or lien that could justify emergency action. It had simply existed, tall, healthy, and inconvenient to Karen's garden. Word spread fast throughout the neighborhood. People started choosing sides. Some neighbors, weary of Karen's long history of petty complaints and control issues, quietly offered their support. Others stayed silent, likely afraid of becoming her next target. But the worst part came when Karen tried to play the victim. She claimed I was harassing her, that I was waging a campaign of intimidation. She even called the police once, claiming that I was spying on her, after I took photos from my own backyard for the case file. The officers were professional and visibly tired of being dragged into suburban feuds, but they told her flatly that photographing your own property was perfectly legal. That only seemed to enrage her more. Meanwhile, the court process moved forward. Karen was served. She responded, denying all wrongdoing and claiming she had verbal permission, a lie that was easily disproven, given we hadn't spoken face-to-face in months before the incident. Still, it became clear that she wouldn't settle, wouldn't apologize, and wouldn't back down. That was when I decided to escalate things further, legally and tactically. With my lawyer's help, I requested records from the tree service company she had hired. They were hesitant at first, but once we filed a subpoena, we obtained a work order with her name, signature, and payment receipt. It was official. Karen had hired them specifically to remove my tree. No gray area, no misunderstanding, just premeditated destruction. And now we had the evidence. The stage was set. Court was scheduled. Karen didn't know it yet, but her smug attitude was about to cost her more than just the shade she hated so much. The courthouse was small, tucked between a post office and a DMV. One of those humble municipal buildings with faded tile floors and flickering fluorescent lights. But despite its modest appearance, it was about to host a confrontation that had been building for weeks, maybe even years, depending on how far back you measured Karen's entitled behavior. I arrived early, wearing a clean button-down and carrying a thick binder of evidence. My lawyer had advised me to remain calm and composed, no matter what Karen did. This wasn't a reality show, it was a legal process. But I won't lie, I was nervous. Even with all the proof on my side, there's always a little part of you that wonders what trick the other party might pull. Karen, unsurprisingly, arrived late, flustered, dressed in something that could best be described as business casual fury, and dragging a rolling tote full of papers that she clearly hadn't organized. She didn't acknowledge me when she walked in, though I noticed the moment she saw my lawyer sitting beside me. Her lips thinned. Her expression hardened. Reality was starting to sink in. When the judge called our case, we were invited to stand. Karen immediately launched into her version of events, unprompted and unstructured, as if she thought telling her story first would give her the moral high ground. She painted a picture of a dangerous, diseased tree that loomed over her backyard. She claimed it dropped acorns that damaged her garden, blocked essential sunlight from her vegetables, and posed an ongoing threat to her property. She said she tried to resolve things informally, though she had no emails, messages, or any form of contact to support that. She even claimed I had previously given her tacit approval to prune the tree, though she quickly added that the removal was an emergency situation. Her testimony was a mess of contradictions. And then, it was our turn. My lawyer was calm, professional, and surgical. She introduced the arborist's report, which described the oak as structurally sound, disease-free, and of significant value. She laid out the photos I had taken the morning after the incident. She showed the deed with the clearly marked property lines, lines that placed the tree firmly in my yard, not Karen's. Then came the smoking gun, the subpoenaed work order from the tree removal company, signed and dated by Karen, with the instructions: remove large oak tree near fence line. Do not contact neighbor. The judge leaned in slightly when he read that. Karen's face began to change, the confident smirk gone, replaced by a tightening jaw and reddening cheeks. But she still wasn't done fighting. She interrupted repeatedly, claiming the tree company had misunderstood her, that she didn't know they'd cut the whole thing down. She said she never meant to have the entire tree removed. She even accused the arborist of being biased, saying I must have paid him to exaggerate the value. The judge wasn't impressed. He reminded Karen, sternly, that hiring a contractor to do something illegal does not absolve her of responsibility. He also explained, in no uncertain terms, that cutting down a tree on someone else's property without permission was a serious offense, civilly, and in some cases even criminally. Then came the ruling. He found in my favor on all counts. Karen had trespassed. Karen had caused deliberate and irreversible damage to my property. The arborist's valuation of $18,000 was accepted as fair and reasonable. On top of that, because the act was deemed willful, the court awarded treble damages under state law. Total judgment, $54,000. For a moment, the courtroom was dead silent. Karen blinked, clearly stunned. Then, in a last-ditch attempt at deflection, she asked if she could pay in installments, claiming she didn't have that kind of money lying around. The judge told her any payment arrangement would be between her and the court collections office, but the judgment would stand, effective immediately. When we left the courtroom, Karen stormed out ahead of us, gripping her rolling tote like it might fly away. She didn't look back. Not once. My lawyer shook my hand, congratulated me, and said that while collecting the full amount could take time, the judgment was enforceable. If Karen refused to pay, we could garnish wages, place liens on her property, or seize assets. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the money, though. I was thinking about the principle. This wasn't just about a tree. It was about boundaries, literally and figuratively. About standing up to the kind of person who believed the rules didn't apply to her, who thought she could do whatever she wanted as long as she was loud and stubborn enough. And for once, someone like that had lost. As I pulled out of the courthouse parking lot, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw Karen standing near her car, talking furiously on her phone. Maybe she was venting to a friend. Maybe she was calling her HOA buddies. Maybe she was on the line with a new lawyer. Didn't matter. The verdict was in, but the story wasn't quite over yet. Because in the weeks that followed, Karen would try one last desperate move, and it would backfire spectacularly. I thought it would end in court. The judgment was clear, the evidence was overwhelming, and Karen had been humiliated in front of a judge. That should have been the final chapter, but people like Karen don't like to lose quietly. Especially not when they've spent years building their entire identity around control, intimidation, and passive-aggressive warfare. In the weeks following the court ruling, I started to notice small things. At first, they were subtle, almost petty enough to overlook. My mailbox, once perfectly level, suddenly leaned slightly to the left. I'd straighten it, only to find it off-kilter again a few days later. My trash cans, which I always tucked neatly along the side of my house, began appearing at odd angles, occasionally tipped over. Never enough to scream vandalism, but just enough to be annoying. Then came the HOA notices. One after another, I received warnings in the mail for alleged violations. Weeds in my front yard, none. A garden hose left out too long, it wasn't. And my personal favorite, unauthorized landscaping changes. That one made me laugh out loud. The only landscaping that had changed was the gaping hole in my yard where a 40-year-old oak tree used to be. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind the sudden surge in complaints. Karen had friends on the HOA board. She didn't just report things, she weaponized them. But things escalated further. One morning, I walked outside to find a huge sign staked into the patch of lawn nearest Karen's property line. In all caps, it read, "This yard is under legal dispute. Proceed with caution." It was clearly meant to intimidate. A scare tactic, designed to stir up gossip and make it look like I was the problem. The implication being that the issue was ongoing, that I was being sued, or that there was some danger in associating with me. I removed the sign immediately, took photos, and called my lawyer. That's when we discovered something that changed everything. Karen had filed an appeal on the judgment. Now, appeals in civil court aren't granted automatically. You have to present new evidence or prove that there was a legal error during the original trial. But Karen wasn't appealing based on new information. She was trying to argue that the value of the tree had been inflated and that she had reason to believe the tree was on her property. It was a Hail Mary, a flimsy, poorly supported attempt to avoid paying what she owed. But it meant I had to go back to court again and defend what had already been decided. This time, my lawyer was even more prepared. She pulled property surveys, historic aerial images from the city archives, and even brought in the original arborist for live testimony. We demonstrated not only that the tree was 100% on my property, but that Karen had a clear line of sight to the boundary markers when she ordered the tree's removal. The appeal was denied, swiftly and decisively. But here's where karma finally kicked in. Unbeknownst to Karen, the appeal and her fake sign weren't just stunts, they were evidence. Evidence of continued harassment after a court ruling. And my lawyer filed for a protective order and an injunction. Legal tools that could prevent her from further interference and in some cases, allow for additional damages. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just someone who made a bad decision about a tree, she was someone actively violating a legal judgment and harassing a neighbor under court protection. But even that wasn't the most satisfying part. You see, while Karen was busy playing courtroom chess with a broken board, she forgot something important. Court judgments don't just disappear. They accrue interest. Every month, she delayed payment. The amount she owed me was growing, with interest. My lawyer filed the paperwork to enforce collection through a property lien, meaning if she ever tried to sell her house or refinance her mortgage, she'd be legally required to pay me first. And when word got out, as it always does in neighborhoods like ours, the social fallout was immediate. The very HOA she used as a weapon began distancing itself from her. She was quietly removed from the gardening subcommittee. Invitations to the local events she loved posting about on Facebook stopped arriving. People didn't want to be associated with someone who harassed neighbors, lost in court, and then doubled down with fake signs and lies. She had gone from feared to pitted almost overnight. But Karen, stubborn as ever, still refused to write the check. She didn't know it yet, but that refusal was about to set off a chain reaction that would cost her far more than the tree or the judgment. Because once a lien is filed and ignored long enough, there's another tool at the court's disposal. And it's one word that terrifies people like Karen more than anything else. Foreclosure. Karen had made her decision. Whether out of pride, spite, or sheer delusion, she refused to pay the court-ordered judgment. Not a single cent. The total now hovered just under $60,000, thanks to late fees and accruing interest, and she acted as though ignoring it would somehow make it go away. But courts don't forget, and neither does the law. The property lien we had filed after the appeal denial wasn't just symbolic. It was a financial noose, one Karen seemed blissfully unaware of, or at least chose to ignore. For months, she carried on with her usual routine. Watering her garden, rearranging lawn ornaments, even hosting a few awkward get-togethers that felt more like desperate attempts at saving face than actual social events. Behind the scenes, however, the machine was turning. Once the lien passed the statutory threshold for enforcement, my lawyer filed for a judicial foreclosure, a legal process that allows a creditor, in this case, me, to recover a debt by forcing the sale of the debtor's property. It's rare in neighborhood disputes, but perfectly legal when large judgments go unpaid. Karen, of course, was notified, served with the formal paperwork that spelled it out in black and white. Pay the judgment or risk losing your home. Still, she did nothing. I expected some kind of reaction, a tantrum, a last-ditch email, a weepy apology. But instead, there was just silence, as if she couldn't accept that it was really happening. The court granted our request. The foreclosure process began. A court-appointed trustee was assigned to oversee the sale. A notice was placed on public record. A legal notice ran in the local paper. And finally, a sale date was set. The day Karen's home would be auctioned to satisfy her debt. Only then, with just weeks to go, did Karen finally surface. She tried to stall the process, filing a motion to delay the sale on humanitarian grounds. She claimed she had nowhere else to go, and that losing her home would be catastrophic. It was a plea for sympathy, the same kind of emotional manipulation she'd used on neighbors for years. But the judge was unmoved. She had multiple chances to resolve the matter. She had ignored everyone. The sale date held firm. As the auction neared, Karen's behavior shifted. She became reclusive, rarely seen outside. Her once pristine lawn grew wild. Packages stacked up on her porch. The yard signs she'd been so fond of, the welcome spring, banners, and support local slogans, disappeared. She stopped posting in the neighborhood Facebook group altogether. Then, 2 days before the auction, her house went dark. That morning, I saw a moving truck parked in her driveway. A couple of guys in uniforms were hauling furniture into the back of the truck, dressers, boxes, even a bird bath I remembered seeing in her garden for years. Karen wasn't directing them. She just stood nearby, arms folded, face blank. She didn't wave. She didn't look angry. She just looked defeated. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. The tree she destroyed still wasn't back, and frankly, I didn't think it ever would be. You can't regrow something like that overnight. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about consequences. The auction happened as scheduled. The home sold quickly, not surprising given the market. A young couple, first-time buyers, purchased it and planned to renovate. They were quiet, polite, and seemed genuinely excited to join the neighborhood. When I introduced myself, I didn't mention Karen. I figured they'd hear the story eventually. As for the money, once the sale was finalized and the bank collected what it was owed, my portion, the judgment, was paid in full directly from the proceeds. Just over $60,000 transferred to my account. The debt Karen swore she'd never pay had been collected with the full force of the law. And it wasn't just about the money. It was about what it represented. Every time she ignored a court order, every time she tampered with my property, every time she acted like rules were optional, it all added up to this. She didn't lose her home because of one mistake. She lost it because of who she was. And in the end, that cost her more than any tree ever could. Karen was gone. Just like that. The woman who had ruled the neighborhood like a self-appointed monarch had vanished. Her once manicured home, now owned by a friendly young couple with more enthusiasm than ego, was undergoing slow, thoughtful renovations. The tension in the air had lifted. The tight-lipped smiles at block parties were replaced with genuine conversations. It felt like a long, slow exhale after years of holding our collective breath. But for me, it wasn't quite over. Not yet. The spot where my oak tree once stood remained a painful void, an empty patch of grass that looked wrong no matter how neatly I trimmed it. I hadn't fully realized how much that tree meant to me until it was gone. It wasn't just a source of shade. It wasn't just a marker of property or value. It was a piece of my childhood, a constant in a world that changed too quickly. And Karen had taken it, carelessly, as if it were just another nuisance she could remove without consequence. But justice had been served. The debt was paid. The battle was over. Now came the healing. That spring, I planted a new tree. It wasn't another oak. I wanted something that would grow fast and bloom early. I chose a tulip poplar, a native species, tall and proud, with golden blossoms that burst into view like fireworks each year. I hired a landscaper to help me place it just right, ensuring it had room to grow and flourish. As we dug the hole, I watched the soil turn, rich, dark earth full of memory. Beneath it all, Remnants of sawdust still lingered, a faint trace of the past. But I didn't feel bitter. Not anymore. What Karen had destroyed, I could rebuild. And this time, it would grow taller, brighter, and stronger than before. The neighborhood rallied around the change. Several neighbors stopped by to comment on the new tree, offering compliments and, in hushed tones, relief that things had finally settled down. One family even brought over lemonade as a kind of symbolic peace offering. Not that we had been at war, but we had all lived under Karen's shadow in different ways. Without her constant interference, the HOA seemed more relaxed too. No more anonymous complaints about mailbox colors or trash cans left out too long. People started planting flowers without worrying about getting fined. A few families put up porch swings and string lights. Kids played louder. Music played longer. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again. I kept to myself for the most part, but I noticed the changes. And I noticed something else too. One morning, I received a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, neatly folded. It read, "I thought I was doing the right thing. I was wrong. I lost a lot, but I needed to. I hope you plant another tree." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. I didn't feel any satisfaction reading it. I didn't feel vindicated. Just closure. Karen had made her choices, and she'd paid the price for them. It was too late to undo the damage she caused, but perhaps, just perhaps, not too late for her to reflect on it. The tulip poplar bloomed that year. Bright yellow blossoms, like tiny cups of sunlight, dotted its branches and caught the attention of every passerby. It wasn't as big as the old oak, not yet, but it would get there. In time, it would spread its limbs wide and cast a new kind of shade, not one that annoyed or offended, but one that offered comfort. A reminder that even after destruction, life goes on. And sometimes, it grows back stronger than ever.